Even the most casual sports fans know about the season of Shohei Ohtani and the kind of year he's having for the California Angels. Ohtani is both pitching and hitting for the Angels, which is simply unheard of in the modern era of baseball. Pitchers simply don't hit well, and in the American League, they don't hit at all, thanks to the designated hitter rule that allows for another player to bat in the pitcher's spot. But Shohei Ohtani is a starting pitcher for the Angels and their designated hitter. And he's not just pitching and hitting as a novelty. He's doing both extremely well. His record so far this year as a starting pitcher is 9 wins to only 2 losses, with 136 strikeouts, which is among the Major League's best. And as far as his hitting goes, he's only hit 44 home runs this year, which is second in the league. Oh, and he's also stolen 23 bases just for good measure. Ohtani can pitch, he can hit, and he has blazing speed on the base pads. He's the most exciting player in baseball, and in my mind, the odds-on favorite to win the American League MVP award to go along with his Rookie of the Year award from 2018. The legend of Shohei Ohtani is one of the best stories to come out of Japan. But it's not the only one. Here in America, we tend to only be familiar with Western history. We know about the Greeks and the Romans, and we learn European and American history in school, but we tend to forget that there is a whole other storyline playing out that whole time on the opposite side of the world. But the ancient histories of the East and West rarely crossed over. But every now and then, a story from Japanese history is so compelling that it crosses the Pacific and slips into our American culture, much like Shohei Ohtani's story. And one such story is that of the 47 Ronin. And we're not talking about the Keanu Reeves movie from 2013. That film was more fantasy than history, but the real story of the 47 Ronin is much more compelling. It's a story of honor, revenge, and anger, and it still resonates 3 centuries later. In the 18th century, Japan was controlled by a series of military generals known as the shogun. The shogun ruled in the name of the emperor, and under the shogun were regional lords who employed their own personal armies of fierce warriors known as samurai. All samurai were expected to live by the law of Bushido, which was the way of the warrior. They held to a strict code of honor, which included loyalty to their master and fearlessness in the face of death. But every now and then, a samurai's master would suffer an undignified death. So the samurai would be relegated to the status of Ronin, which meant they were warriors without a master. And that's exactly what happened to the warriors of a regional aristocrat named Asano. In 1701, Asano was sent to Tokyo as a young man to perform some diplomatic obligations with another young noble named Keima. When they arrived, they were received by a royal official named Kira. Kira was a rude and arrogant man, and he constantly belittled his 2 politically inexperienced guests. Kame became so enraged at Kira for his shameful conduct that he was ready to kill him. But Asano pled for patience. After all, anyone who drew his weapon in the palace was subject to the death penalty, and a pompous windbag like Kira wasn't worth dying over. So Kame's anger was temporarily satiated. Unfortunately, Asano's was unable to take his own advice. Kira's contemptible treatment became so insulting that Asano himself lost his temper and attacked him with his sword. Kira suffered only a superficial wound to his head before Asano could be restrained, but it didn't matter. Asano had committed a capital offense. He was arrested and ordered to commit seppuku, which was a ritual suicide by knife. To retain his honor, Asano dutifully stabbed himself in the chest and died. His property was confiscated, his family was left destitute, and his army of 320 samurai were reduced to the status of Ronin. Most of them followed their master in seppuku, but 47 of the Ronin were so angry and offended that their master had been shamefully treated by Kira that they bucked the tradition for the opportunity to exact their revenge. So the 47 Ronin swore a secret oath to kill Kira at all costs. Their only problem was that Kira was a wealthy and influential public figure, and upon hearing that the 47 Ronin hadn't killed themselves, he fortified his home with his own security detail and rarely ventured out. so the Ronin had to bide their time. To ease Kira's suspicion, many of them moved out of the region and took lowly jobs as common laborers. Their leader, a warrior named Oishi, even pretended to be a drunkard. And he must have been convincing. When another samurai saw him lying in the street in a supposed drunken stupor, he kicked Oishi in the face for his dishonorable behavior. But Oishi was all in with the vendetta. He sent his wife and children away for their own protection and continued preparations for the inevitable attack. After more than a year, thinking he was finally in the clear, Kira began to let down his guard. And that's exactly what the 47 Ronin were waiting for. After all, revenge is a dish best served cold. So they reconvened, and on the snowy night of December 14th, 1702, the Ronin quietly warned Kira's neighbors that they should stand down if they didn't want to get hurt. They silently scaled the wall of Kira's estate, taking his guards by surprise. Hearing the commotion outside and fearing the worst, Kira jumped out of bed, and he ran outside in his underwear and hid himself in a storage shed. The Ronin burst into Kira's chamber and found his bed empty, but it was still warm. He had to be nearby, and after a thorough search of his property, they found Kira's hiding place. He was cowering in the corner. The Ronin confirmed Kira's identity by the scar that had been left on his head by their master. Oishi demanded that he maintain at least a shred of dignity by committing seppuku, but Kira's hands were trembling with fear, so Oishi cut off his miserable head. The Ronin regathered in the courtyard and found that they had all survived the attack. They marched to Asano's grave and presented Kira's severed head in triumph and waited to be arrested by the authorities. Everyone hated Kira, and the public was inspired by the Ronin's steadfast loyalty to their master, but the authorities could not allow such lawlessness to stand. So they sentenced the Ronin to death, and without hesitation, they committed seppuku. The Ronin were buried with their master, and among the first people to visit their graves was the samurai who had insulted Oishi by kicking him in the face. And for dishonoring such a worthy samurai, he too stabbed himself in the chest and died. Geez, life was rough for samurai. As the time went on, the fame of the 47 Ronin spread. Their glorious martyrdom went down in history as an utmost example of honor for the Japanese. The Asano family's name was restored, while Kira's descendants were besmirched with eternal shame, and the nation's faith in the order of the samurai was restored. So what do we do with the story of the 47 Ronin? It's problematic, isn't it? We see the rightness of their cause. After all, their sense of honor had been offended, and their anger seemed warranted. We love it when the bad guy gets his comeuppance and justice prevails. But is cold, hard revenge ever truly justified? How much blood must be spilled ultimately to truly even the score? And can suicide ever restore a sense of honor? But aside from all these problems, we shouldn't forget that this whole set of circumstances came about because the master of these samurai had lost his temper with an arrogant buffoon. It doesn't seem right that they were put in that position in the first place. History has shown that anger is a complicated emotion, and revenge is a complex process. Indeed, as we'll see in today's passage, our tragic hero Samson had much in common with the 47 Ronin. At times, he seems bound by anger, and many of us can relate to that today. Our ire owns us, and we hate it. We don't even know what we're so mad about sometimes. Yet at other times, Samson's fury seemed justified and his response measured. When his honor was violated, Samson's drive to fulfill his destiny was fueled by righteous indignation. And he showed us that we can learn to use our emotions without being consumed by them. After all, the same fire that lights our way can also burn it down. So I'm going to encourage you to turn your Bibles to Judges 15 this morning. If you don't have a Bible, you're welcome to take out one of ours located underneath the pew in front of you and turn to page 214. Or feel free to scan the QR code on the worksheet in your bulletin with your smartphone, and it will take you directly to Judges 15, page 214 in your pew Bibles. This is message number 3 of our September mini-series of messages entitled muscle-bound, the Samson saga. Everyone is bound by something. Some are bound by fate, others are bound by vanity, and still others are bound by wrath, vengeance, or lust. The Old Testament hero Samson was a deeply flawed man bound by many torments. But despite all this, he still believed in God, which meant he was also bound for redemption, just like us. Now, for those of you who are here for the first time or first time in a long time, allow me to get you caught up to speed with the story of Samson. The angel of the Lord appeared to an Israelite man named Manoah and his wife to inform them that their soon-to-be son was destined by God to defeat the godless Philistines who had been horribly and brutally dominating their people for 40 years. And the only instructions his parents were given was that Samson was to never drink wine or cut his hair, according to the vows God had given in the Old Testament book of Numbers for men who are set apart for God's special purpose. So Manoah and his wife raised Samson the best they knew how, and Samson grew up with God stirring in his heart to defeat the incomparably wicked Philistines. The only problem was that when Samson came of age, he fell in love with the enemy. He lusted after a Philistine woman, and he demanded that his parents get her to be his wife. But God could use this youthful indiscretion to fulfill Samson's destiny. On the day of his wedding, a lion attacked him, and for the first time the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so he was endowed with great strength to kill the lion. Samson learned from this altercation that as long as God was with him, he could never be defeated. Well, during the wedding feast, a dispute broke out between Samson and the Philistines, which led to a skirmish that left 30 Philistines dead. Then, due to Samson's unmitigated rage over the incident, he left his wife to go home and live with his parents. So the woman's father, thinking that Samson was gone for good, gave her to a Philistine man to be his wife instead. Little did he know, as we'll see in today's passage, that Samson would come back. And like the 47 Ronin, pain was coming with him. Samson was a man who had been bound by anger his entire life. But when his honor was gravely insulted in this passage, he found a way to control his emotions and use them to fulfill God's destiny for his life. And we need to learn this too. And so let's see how it all went down. Judges chapter 15, starting in verse 1. Let's read some of this together. After some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, I will go to my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to him, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So verse 1 indicates that the action of this chapter happened some days after the action of the last chapter. We don't know how many days, but it must have been a significant amount of time because we are going to see that a significant change happened to Samson during this time. We're going to see him grow up from an impetuous teenager to a responsible and restrained adult. So what does Samson mean by, this time I shall be innocent, from verse 3? What happened in the last chapter over which he evidently felt some guilt? Well, as we've already mentioned, he must be hearkening back to that time he killed the 30 Philistines in a fit of rage after they humiliated him in a wager. Judges 14, just to refresh your memory, verses 19 and 20, it said, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So in our passage today, Samson seemed to show some contrition for a change. He seemed to acknowledge that the skirmish that led to these Philistines' death may have been an overreaction from his hot anger. He had been bound by his rage, but this time he said he would be innocent for whatever pain he would rain down on them. We see some maturity here. Like the vendetta of the 47 Ronin, this was a more calculated act of revenge. Now, I'm not justifying his actions here. Revenge never ends well for anyone. As we'll see, it's a never-ending cycle of escalation. But I am commending how Samson seemed to keep his anger in check. The Philistines had taken his wife from him, so he would take something from them without shedding any blood this time. Let's pick up the story again in verse 4 of Judges 15. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain as well as the olive orchards. So we still have a sense of honor in our culture, but it's nothing like the honor system in other cultures. We see forgiveness as a virtue, and it is, according to Jesus. But as we've already seen from the 47 Ronin, maintaining one's honor was especially important in past cultures, more important than forgiveness in relationships and family and even life itself. The Ronin didn't kill out of unmitigated rage. There was no honor in that. They killed out of a sense of honor, at least in their minds. Again, I'm not condoning the act of revenge, but I am applauding them for keeping their anger in check. And we catch a glimpse of this with Samson. Samson's honor had been deeply offended when his wife was given away, but instead of burning with hot anger as he did before, he took a more calculated route. He burned their crops instead. He coated the tails of some foxes in pitch, he set them on fire, and sent them into the Philistines' fields. While before he was a hothead who killed people when he got angry, this time he evened the score in a more equitable fashion by simply destroying some property. Not good, but at least improvement. But again, I think Samson underestimated the violence and wickedness of the Philistines because they took this feud to the next level. Picking up the story in verse 6. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit." And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of rock of Edom. Many of you have surely seen Mel Gibson's 1995 Academy Award-winning movie Braveheart, which portrayed the life of the Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace. Audiences loved the movie, but historians eviscerated it. They complained that some of the film's characters were made up and the timeline of historical events was skewed to aid the story and some of the battles were misrepresented. But I'm going to defend Mel Gibson on this one because so much of William Wallace's life was shrouded in mystery. There are huge gaps in the contemporary historical accounts. So as a result, much of the movie's content was taken from Henry the Blind's epic poem, The Wallace, which was written in 1488 AD, about a century and a half after the events of Wallace's life. In other words, the poem and the movie were based on a true story, but dramatic liberties were taken to spice up the narrative. For example, in the film, William Wallace was portrayed as a peace-loving man until his wife Murren was murdered by the English sheriff of Lanark. This triggers Wallace's rage, which seems justified, and he returns to Lanark to cut down the sheriff and all his men. This event, in turn, kicks off the Scottish Wars of Independence against Edward I of England. And according to Harry the Blind, Wallace was indeed married to a woman named Marion Bradefute. According to his epic poem, the sheriff showed up at her door looking for Wallace, but Marion argued with him until William Wallace had a chance to escape out the back. When the sheriff realized he had been tricked, he killed Marion in a fit of rage, thereby setting off the series of events that led to the Scottish independence movement. By the way, some historians are beginning to doubt the existence of a historical Marion Bradefute because there are no contemporary records of any person with such name. They insist that William Wallace was never married and had no children, but we'll probably never know for sure. But what is for certain is that William Wallace did indeed kill the sheriff of Lanyard, rather brutally, in fact. And he didn't just do it because the sheriff may or may not have murdered his wife. William Wallace had always hated the English for their oppression of his people, and he didn't need any other reason to pick a fight with them other than that. Avenging his wife's death would have only added fuel to the fire. It wouldn't have started it. And that's what we see with Samson. He needed no extra motivation to fight the Philistines. God had called him to defeat these brutally wicked people who were mercilessly smothering any trace of Israelite independence. But when they brutally murdered his wife, that's when they crossed over the Rubicon, so to speak. And Samson was going to make them pay. But again, Samson's anger, even in this situation, was measured. He would be avenged, but then he pledged in verse 7 that after his vendetta was satisfied, he would quit. Could it be that Samson was not bound by his anger anymore? Has he grown as a person? That seems to be the case. It says in verse 8 that he struck them with a great blow, but then he went off into the mountains in an apparent attempt to distance himself from the Philistines and the Israelites. It seems that he wanted the violence to stop. But that's not how the Philistines rolled. They came against the Israelites in retaliation. Picking up the story in verse 9. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We have come up to bind Samson to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so have I done to them." And they said to him, "We have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves." And they said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now notice the Israelites here had completely lost the will to fight. They seemed to be resigned to the fact that the Philistines were rulers over them, and their only option was appeasement. But Samson was convinced that this was simply not an option anymore. He would inspire the Israelites to fight. And really, this chapter seems to be Samson's finest moment. He showed humility and contrition. He started to understand his destiny, and he wasn't bound by raw anger any longer. Like the 47 Ronin, his revenge was calculated. But he couldn't defeat them himself. No matter how physically strong he may have been, no man can defeat an army by himself. So he took this opportunity to instigate a fight between the Israelites and the Philistines. He could have simply turned himself into the Philistines, but he insisted that the Israelites take him there. He was going to show them how to fight. Picking up the story in verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and he put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. Now, I don't think we are to assume that Samson struck down 1,000 men by himself. This wasn't like a Bruce Lee movie where all the bad guys wait their turn to fight the hero one at a time. He picked up the jawbone and he urged the Israelites to fight, and fight they did. When a bully gets punched in the nose, he usually backs down, and accordingly the Philistines became afraid of Samson after he had routed them in battle. At the end of the chapter, we see that the Israelites won their independence. Skip down to verse 20, and Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. And so let's review the evolution of Samson over the course of these some days. In chapter 14, Samson was portrayed as a slave to his emotions. He absolutely insisted that the Philistine woman become his wife, and he wouldn't listen to his parents. He completely was controlled by his passions, and more pointedly, he was bound by his anger. After the Philistines had made a fool of him, in his hot anger, he used the physical gift God had given him to kill 30 of them. It was a complete overreaction. But according to our passage today, after some days, we see a different Samson starting to emerge. When his honor was offended and his wife was given to someone else, Samson didn't fly off the handle. He learned something. He said that this time he would handle it differently, and his response to the Philistines was measured. He was certainly angry, but he put a limit on his rage. And when the Philistines responded by killing his wife and her family, Samson responded in kind. But he only went so far. Then he quit. He tried to limit the revenge cycle. So Samson didn't turn into a cold fish. He was a man of passion still. But instead of being bound by anger or trying to suppress it, he put a boundary around it. He learned to put a fence around his emotions. And that's our main point from today's passage. It's in your bulletin if you'd like to write it down. The main point was Samson learned to put a cage around his rage. He put a cage around his rage. Many of us are familiar with the Apostle Paul's command concerning anger when he said in Ephesians 4:26, be angry and do not sin. He doesn't say don't get angry. He doesn't say if you happen to get angry. He says be angry. There are certain things that are worth getting angry about. When innocent people get hurt, then normal, healthy people should feel angry about it. I get mad when people use religion to enslave people. In fact, I get angry when anyone forces anyone to do things against their will. But here's the key to Paul's little directive here. He said, be angry and do not sin. Paul put a cage around his anger. Paul got angry, and he would let that anger burn for a while. He would feel it, but he wouldn't let it cross over the boundary from justified indignation to spiteful rage. He wouldn't allow it to cause him to do things that would be hurtful and cruel to others. He used it as fuel to get the proper things done. And it's not just anger. I think it applies to all emotions. Be sad and do not sin. Whenever Paul experienced something sad, he gave himself the permission to feel it. We need that sometimes, but he put a cage around it. 2 Corinthians 4:8, he said, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. He wouldn't allow limitless sorrow to cross the line into despair. He put a limit on his sadness. In his happiness, he didn't sin. Be happy and do not sin. He didn't allow his celebration to fall into debauchery. He moderated his emotions, just as King Solomon advised, the very wise Old Testament king. In Ecclesiastes 3:4, he says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. There's a limit around our emotions. But to be honest, most of us probably can relate to the Samson of chapter 14 from last week. We set no boundaries on our emotions, and our anger spills over until we hurt people with it. And it seems to be especially true with men and anger. You know, we yell at our kids, and we maybe tear down our spouses, we blow up at our coworkers, but we can't seem to figure out what we're so angry about. And I'm convinced that we're not really mad at our families or coworkers, not ultimately. I think we get so mad because we're just unhappy with our lives in general. Maybe we feel underappreciated at work, or our home life feels chaotic. Our baseball team loses, and we take it out on everyone else. And if that's the case, I want to encourage us to work on the things that are making our lives unhappy before we try to deal with the anger itself. Because if we don't deal with the things that are making us unhappy, then we're just window dressing with our anger. Most of the time, I think anger is just a symptom of a problem. But self-improvement is hard work, so we usually it's a lot easier to lash out, isn't it? And for many people, anger is their go-to emotion. Listen, if you're mad all the time, maybe the problem is with you and not the people who are making you mad. Because all of us suffer the same indignities and injustices every day, but not all of us are flying off the handle. But for those of us who we want to actually take the time for self-reflection, and we want to get a hold of our anger because it's making us miserable, what's our first instinct? It's to suppress it. And that works for about 5 minutes, right? But what did Paul do? Paul was angry. And sometimes this anger drove him to do certain things, but he put a limit to it. Paul let the anger happen, but he predetermined the boundaries. And evidently, he thought the course of a day was a good upper limit for his anger. In Ephesians 4:26, the second part of that verse is this. He says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. Now, Jesus, of course, is our best example for everything, and Jesus felt the whole range of emotions very deeply. Jesus got angry. When he saw the religious leaders oppressing the poor, needy, and sin-weary, he allowed himself to get mad, but he was always in control. When he drove the money changers out of the temple, his anger drove him to action, but he pushed over tables. He didn't hurt people. And when the heat of the moment was over, it was definitely over for Jesus. After that little episode where he overturned the tables, it says in Matthew 21, and leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. So when it was done, he left it. Jesus also felt sadness and openly wept on several occasions in Scripture, but he always set a boundary. He set a reasonable timetable to feel his sadness, and then he stopped. A great example of this was the intense emotions he felt in the Garden of Gethsemane just before his arrest and execution. It says in Matthew 26, then Jesus went with him to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking Peter with him and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to feel, how? Sorrowful and troubled. Jesus felt sorrow intensely, but he put a limit on it. His sadness was just for a time, and when it was over, he made sure it was over. Look at the rest of the passage. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. So that, see, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us get going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So when the hour was at hand and it was done, Jesus picked himself up and got down to business. He wasn't driven to despair from his sorrow. Put a limit on it. Jesus' emotions, they were focused. And he experienced the fullness of them in short bursts rather than long, drawn-out episodes that get us usually in trouble. We referred to Bruce Lee a little earlier, and that's because Bruce Lee was a stud. Wasn't a large man. He was only 5'8", maybe weighed around 130 pounds, but he was impossibly powerful. And when Bruce Lee used to go around performing kung fu demonstrations for audiences, everybody wanted to always see his infamous one-inch punch. And Lee would demonstrate it. He would stand face-to-face with his opponent, and he would hold his fist just an inch away from the poor guy's chest. But he was able to concentrate so much torque from his hips and his legs and his shoulders that allowed him to just deliver a devastating blow just from 1 inch away that would send a guy flying back 16 feet. He could even break boards with his 1-inch punch. Folks, we need to take the same principles and apply them to our emotions. We need to master emotional kung fu. The Apostle Paul, Jesus, King Solomon, and even Samson learned to channel their emotions to deliver an appropriate, measured blow, and no more. They were not bound by their anger. They were in control of it, and they unleashed it within appropriate boundaries, not outside the boundaries where it would lead to sin. Everything was premeditated and focused. No energy was wasted, and when it was over, it was over. They saw their emotions not as annoyances to be suppressed, but as opportunities to get God's work done. So our application from today's passage is this, and it's in your bulletin. The application is to ponder your emotional opportunities before you squander them. Ponder your emotional opportunities. Be premeditated with your emotions and the boundaries you will put on them. Ponder them before you just squander them and you go off and do something you regret. When the Apostle Paul was making his famous statement about anger, he seems to have been quoting an Old Testament passage from which we get some additional insight, and this helps us. He was quoting Psalm 4, verse 4, which says, "Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent." Before we exercise emotions, we need to ponder them. These emotions are opportunities to do God's work as Samson used them. These emotions are opportunities to do God's work as Jesus used his anger. Without righteous anger, Samson wouldn't have had the motivation or the energy to defeat the Philistines. He needed to be angry, as Paul said. So we are to ponder within our hearts exactly how long and how far we will allow these emotions to go. When something triggers our anger or sadness or fear or even happiness, we will not let them control us. We're going to focus that energy and we're going to be purposeful with it. We're going to tell ourselves exactly how far we're going to let this emotion go, as is appropriate for the situation, and how long we're going to let it last, lest we spill over into the area of sin. I mean, how many of us actually do this? Probably very few. It's no wonder our emotions get completely out of control, right? But we need them because they are the fuel to fulfill God's destiny for our lives. So seize the opportunity. It's our emotions that separate us from the animals, after all, and life without emotion would be pretty bland, right? They truly are a gift from God just as much as Samson's great strength was his. But we must ponder our emotions. We must experience them on purpose, focus them, and strike a quick, measured blow when need be, with whatever emotion we have. The Apostle Peter also chimed in as an advocate of this emotional kung fu. 1 Peter 1, 13 through 14, he said, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance." And I get it because this is completely foreign to how we normally do it. We normally we never take any time to ponder our emotions and prepare our minds for whatever actions our emotions are calling for. Normally, we just let our emotions set the agenda and they're just all over the place. But we can learn, as Apostle Peter has said here, to deliberately focus our emotions, seize the opportunity that those emotions are giving us, and channel them into something productive. Maybe we can channel our anger to give us the courage to have a crucial conversation with someone. Now, we don't come in to the conversation throwing haymakers. We focus our energy into a 1-inch punch. We get right to the point, express the appropriate amount of emotion, and then end it. Or maybe we can channel our sadness into a, short-term pity party, and that's okay sometimes. When something bad happens to us, instead of allowing our sadness to just roll on indefinitely in the back of our minds and just making us fall into despair, we can ponder it and set a limit on it. And then when that limit's over, put it aside. We can give ourselves maybe a day to feel really sad about something that's happened and then make the decision to move on. Now, please don't think I'm trivializing grief. Some losses are so tragic that it takes a long series of painful bouts of sadness to feel some relief, and that's okay too. But for the small stuff, the everyday stuff, set the limit in your head, focus your emotions, and then deliver the quick blow and be done with it. Most of us live our lives bound by anger, and our emotions call the shots. But Samson showed us that we can put a cage around our rage. These emotions we feel are God-given opportunities to fuel his call in our lives. So we shouldn't squander them. Instead, we should ponder how we feel. Focus them to deliver the appropriate decisive blow, and whatever that is, in fulfilling God's destiny for our lives. And then be done with it. That is how a healthy person lives out their emotional life. Samson should be applauded for mastering his anger. But as we'll see next week, he never quite applied this emotional kung fu to other desires. Women would be a constant struggling block in his life. And one of those stumbling blocks in particular would come crashing down on him. So read Judges 16 this week and bring a friend next Sunday for the final curtain call of our tragic hero who seemed to be bound for destruction, but in reality was bound for redemption. Let's pray. God, thank you for this day and just this beautiful weekend we've had. Lord, I am going to ask that your blessing would be upon these people as they go and live out their week. And Lord, I know that many of us here are bound by emotion. We have this smoldering anger all the time. And Lord, when something just triggers it, we just explode. And Lord, other of us have this kind of just smoldering sadness all the time. And we struggle with despair. Some of us have this maybe smoldering fear and just this constant anxiety. Others, sometimes our happiness gets the best of us and we fall into debauchery. But Lord, I just pray, God, just help us to, at least this week, just to think about it, to ponder it. When something is triggering us and the emotions, these God-given gifts you've given us, that we would put a limit on it, put a cage around it. Pray it would fuel the passions that you have in our lives, but would not spill over into inappropriate actions. And that we would deliver an appropriate, decisive blow and be done. Lord, this isn't an overnight process. This is something that takes years. But I pray, like Samson, we wouldn't give up. And you'd give us control over these emotions to use them as you see fit. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.